Two saturation divers descended to 422 feet when a series of bad decisions and a reduction in safety equipment led to disaster. This is the Wildrake diving disaster. When a diver goes deep, they need a mixture of gases. Typically, this is oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. In saturation diving, it's a mixture of oxygen and helium. The gas that is breathed while diving is at the same pressure as the underwater pressure and therefore denser than air you normally breathe on the surface, so there are more gas particles. Nitrogen and helium is absorbed into the body, though these gases are not used by the body. The diver must decompress at stages slowly allowing the body to equalize by processing excess nitrogen at each stage. These decompression stops are a function of both depth and time. This nitrogen dissolves in the diver's tissue, in blood, muscles, and organs, and if the diver is under long enough, the nitrogen saturates fat and even bone, reaching an equilibrium. If a diver surfaces too quickly, nitrogen bubbles form in the tissue, causing damage to the muscles, blood vessels, and if the diver is under deep enough and long enough, the fat and bone. Naval researchers in the 1950s found that the body reaches a point at which the body will no longer absorb nitrogen, so the diver can stay at depth indefinitely as long as they have air and heat, as well as food, water, and all of the other necessities of life. This discovery brought about saturation diving. The first commercial saturation diving started in 1965. When divers work on deep oil rigs at 400 to 500 feet, they sometimes need 30 to 35 hours to decompress. In saturation diving, the divers simply stay at depth and remain in equilibrium with the nitrogen saturation. The air that the divers breathe is typically 98% helium and 2% oxygen. Instead of constantly ascending and descending and going through those long decompression stages, the divers stay in a compressed chamber. The chamber can either be at working depth underwater or be on the surface, and a compressed diving bell takes the diver down and brings them up to the chamber. Either way, the diver is always under pressure and always saturated. This job is extremely dangerous. Not only is the pressure and the gas mixtures hazardous, these dives are in pure darkness with only their light. A lot of accidents that happen are from the divers being alone in the darkness and seeing shadows swimming around in the dark. Even though these divers go through training and are certified, when these divers are in saturation and in these small quarters for up to weeks at a time, their minds just can't take it, and sometimes they lose it while diving. Saturation diving is truly a dangerous and terrifying occupation. The MS Wildrake was a dive support vessel specifically designed for saturation diving. The Wildrake operated in the North Sea. Not only do the divers have to deal with the standard hazards that come with saturation diving, the North Sea is also extremely cold and very rough. For the Wildrake, the saturation chamber was on the ship, so the divers would be lowered by the bell and lifted up each day as the work was performed. Both the diver's suit and the bell were heated by hot water. The water and air was fed down to the divers by the bell's umbilical. Without the umbilical, the divers would not receive air or heat and would be dead in just hours. The bell was also attached by the lift wire, which was used to raise and lower the bell. Typically, a bell also has a weight called a clump, which sits lower than the bell. The clump is a backup recovery system. In the event that there is a problem with the lift wire, the lines running on either side of the bell can be drawn in, raising the clump and the bell. The bell stage can rest on the clump. If there is no clump, can rest on the ocean floor and still allow divers to enter and exit through the hatch if the bell becomes detached from the lift wire or if the lift wire malfunctions. The MS Wildrake was designed with a moon pool for lowering the bell through the center of the ship. The purpose of this trip was to transport a single anchor leg mooring system, SALM. The SALM was to be transported to the Thistle oil fields. In order to do this, the bell had to be modified to be delivered over the side of the Wildrake rather than through the moon pool, to allow the bell to be hoisted over the side of the ship. Further modifications were that the swivel connecting the lift wire to the bell was replaced by shackles, and drop weights had been tied on with nylon rope to prevent accidental release. These drop weights reduce the weight of the bell, allowing the bell to be recovered quickly in case of emergency. On 2 previous occasions, on different bells, these weights had accidentally released, killing several divers. They dove the bell on 17 test dives while modifying the equipment to ensure safety. The Psalm consisted of 3 basic parts: the buoy, the riser, and the base. These 3 parts were connected by articulated universal joints. The purpose of the Psalm was to provide pipes to connect to the Thistle Alpha platform, which fed oil into the base, and the oil would be fed through the base, then the riser, and through hoses to a shuttle oil tanker directly. This allowed tankers to couple to the buoy and be filled with oil for transport. The divers, whose job it was to connect the Psalm for transport, were Richard Walker and Victor Gill. Walker and Gill attached the buoy to the riser and then went deep to attach the riser to the base so the Psalm could be transported. The divers had been in saturation from July 29th until August 7th, when they were lowered to 485 feet to attach the riser to the base. While the bell was being lowered to the ocean floor, the transponder became detached. The transponder sends a signal letting the Wildrake know the location of the bell. The transponder was now dangling and not giving the correct location, so the deck foreman cut the transponder loose so it didn't cause any additional problems. They could not know the exact location of the bell. On the morning of August 8th, Walker was working on the base. Upon his return to the bell, he noticed that the bell was sitting at an angle. He looked up at the top of the bell and discovered that the lift line was no longer attached to the bell. The bell was only supported by the life support umbilical. He immediately radioed the Wildrake and let them know about the emergency and returned to the bell where the other diver, Gill, was waiting. Because the clump weight had been removed, the dive superintendent and the dive supervisor on the Wildrake believed that the umbilical was certified as the backup recovery system. So, with Richard Walker and Victor Gill in the bell, they began raising the bell using the umbilical. Management was wrong. This was not the intended purpose for the umbilical. The tension on the line caused the umbilical to become jammed in the winch, so they decided to use the crane to attach to the umbilical and raise the bell. This severely damaged the umbilical, cutting off power and heat to the bell. The only option at this point was to lower the bell down to the ocean floor at 522 feet. A nearby ship, the Stena Welder, quickly came to assist. However, the dive system on the Stena Welder was in repair, and they could not recover the bell with their crane. Divers from the Stena Welder dove down to the bell to attach a guide wire so the Wildrake could run a cable down to the bell. When the divers from the Stena Welder, Phil Casey Smith and Eddie Frank, arrived on the bottom near the base of the Psalm, the bell wasn't there. It was now 6:09, and Walker and Gill had been without power and heat for 4 hours. Due to the bell not having a transponder, and communication problems, and failure of the lights on the Stena Welder bell that brought down Phil and Eddie, and the simple fact that the crew of the Wildrake had forgotten that they had attempted to raise the bell, in effect moving the bell from the Psalm base, the divers couldn't find the bell. It took over an hour for Phil to find the bell. When Phil found the bell at 7:55, the divers inside were ecstatic to see him and gave him a thumbs up. It then took another hour to attach the guide wire as Phil was being dragged around by the Stena Welder on the rough seas above. The Wildrake lowered the crane cable with wire slings attached, but the cable landed too far from the bell for Phil to attach it to the bell. At this point, Phil checked on the divers. They were now acting very frantically, and Phil knew that he didn't have much time. The Wildrake raised the crane and attached more slings. Phil coupled the bell to the crane and signaled the Wildrake to raise the bell at 10:10. When the Wildrake lifted the bell, the cable was at 45-degree angle. The bell was not lifted straight up, and the Psalm was in the way. The bell wedged against the Psalm base, snapping the wire sling, thwarting any recovery attempt. So work could continue as Phil and Frank were completely exhausted. Frank and Phil were raised to the surface and replaced by divers Michael Mangan and Tony Slayman. Mangan reconnected the cable to the bell, and they raised the bell to the surface at 7:37 that evening. They had now been without power or heat for 17 hours. The bell was attached to the surface saturation chamber where Dr. Morven White, waited in saturation. He examined the divers and they were dead. They had died of hypothermia. After the incident, the Department of Energy found multiple safety violations and evidence of negligence. The widow of Walker and Victor Gill's family filed a lawsuit against Infabco Diving Services, which was under contract to provide the divers. Infabco's defense was that they got the divers from a separate company called Offshore Coordinators. As they could not prove that the divers were employed by Infabco, the lawsuit was dropped. However, the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles awarded Walker's widow $475,000 and Gill's family $75,000. This was not upheld in British courts and therefore was not paid. In the end, a lawsuit in the United Kingdom against 12 defendants was settled, paying Walker's widow $422,000 and Gill's family approximately only $8,000. They also concluded that the divers could have been saved if the Wildrake had investigated the obstruction impeding the lift. Furthermore, Walker's journal was found and his widow read from it at the trials. When commenting on the incompetence of the management of the Wildrake, he stated, "I don't even know if I'm going to get out of here alive." None of the defendants or any companies involved ever admitted to any wrongdoing. In May of 2000, the official accident records stored in London came up missing. Please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.